No.
No cards.
And what, sorry, what was that?
Counterplan, solvency, trafficking, capitalism. Okay. Is anybody not ready?
Oh, I'm sorry, say that again.
Okay. Counterplan, solvency, trafficking, capitalism.
So many papers.
Yes, true.
Let's go.
Alright. Is anybody not ready? On the counterplan, concede the purpose just a test of competition. There's no offense on this flow. We're not going for it. Go to solvency. They say dehumanization is the biggest impact of the round, but it's not. It's the devaluation of human life. At least for when that devaluation of human life by capitalism is bigger than that impact. They say capitalism is constructed in a heteronormative world, but prostitution and valuing life begins in capitalism, not the other way around. They could say consumer demand is the root cause of capitalism, but they have zero evidence to say that. Just by addressing one half of capitalism, they can't address the whole part. They say prostitution does not carry gender implications, but our Peterson evidence says it does. I'll talk more about that on trafficking. Extend our legalism turn-on case by handing over dealing with things like human rights and prostitution to the state. They legitimize the state as a structure to solve these impacts. So by handing over our personal agency to deal with problems to the state, by saying you can legalize things, you can regulate prostitution and solve for trafficking, we end the personal actions that we can take to change the system and actually legitimize state oppression and state action in order to solve these things. By saying, hey, you need to protect our rights, we're saying, state, it's your job to protect rights, and you are the only reason that we have rights, or that anything or anybody has rights. And our Kennedy evidence speaks specifically about rights, saying that handing that role over to the government, it shortcuts political agency, personal agency, and prevents true activism that can actually solve for their impacts, turns the entirety of case. Go to trafficking. They say not all traffic. They say prostitution is not legalized on the demand side, so it doesn't link. But our Matthews evidence talks about how legalizing prostitution in any way leads to street prostitution, specifically in the case where demand is not legalized. And obviously, you can't have the things like brothels in a world where demand is not legalized, because the second that anyone stepped on that property, they'd be arrested. So the only thing that the affirmative allows is street prostitution, which shortcuts any kind of protection for these individuals, prevents their being in a safe environment where they won't be kidnapped, won't be trafficked. They say it doesn't kill agency, doesn't really respond to our Matthews evidence that says that street prostitutes literally have no choice. When their services, when they're in an economic position where their services are demanded, they have no choice but to serve their self-interest and prostitute themselves. They say there are no gender implications of prostitution, but they need to defend the action of their plan text, which speaks of prostitution, and that is set into the legal structure. This interacts with our legalism arguments, because by leaving those gender implications in place and instituting them in the state, they legitimize state stigmas on things like prostitution and sex, and what we would prefer to call sex work. If they were to use that, then they would not institutionalize in the state that stigma. Our Peterson evidence says that it does increase patriarchal domination of women, and they have no evidence to say otherwise, just an analytic. They say the Nordic model doesn't hurt safety, but our Matthews evidence talks about how specifically that kind of a model is terrible for safety standards, because it cannot be because prostitution is taken out of a safe environment. They say feds are key to uniform regulations. Doesn't really respond to any of our evidence about why their model is a bad thing. Capitalism. Extend that there's late evidence doesn't have any warrants about how they're key to solve for capitalism, and extend my analytic that it probably helps people think that capitalism is okay and good. Extend our Matthews evidence that they are that in a world where prostitution demand is allowed to that people are allowed to value themselves and prostitute that sell their own bodies, demand is inevitable, and that people will have no choice. They can't claim that because they leave demand as illegal, people will no longer want to purchase sex services. And our Matthews evidence says that allowing those services to still be sold and allowing people to value their bodies perpetuates capitalism. They say we solve the idea that you can buy a human. No, you don't, because you perpetuate the idea that you can sell yourself. That implicitly brings the idea that you can buy a person. And they say they're a first step, terrible first step. They say they're challenging the demand side, but doesn't answer the arguments that allowing for the supply side to exist implicitly allows for the supply side. So we've turned the entirety of case first with legalism because they place in an organization that has repeatedly failed to deal with these problems the responsibility to deal with them. That shortcuts people's individual agency, shortcuts the feeling of responsibility, and we turn their capitalism impacts because they reinstate this capitalist system. Let me just talk about their slate evidence. I pulled it up online. It literally quotes a guy who says that capitalism is probably, legalization of prostitution probably reinscribes capitalism. Their slate evidence doesn't really take a position on it. It just says we should talk more about things like I think the author's name is Malday, who says that legalizing would cause prostitution or capitalism to be continued. Yeah, so I highly recommend looking at the slate evidence. They have no internal link to solve capitalism, and they claim that that is a prerequisite to solve the affirmative because only that can break down the social institutions like heteronormativity, etc. That's their last piece of evidence on the cap world.